Greetings! Welcome back to Old Ways Rising Farm. We are currently in the middle of what will be, eventually, a very nice windrow. We are putting this in because the first winter we were here, there was a lot of snow piling up along our driveway, which you'll see it here in a second as we pan the camera around a little bit. It's not a super heavy-duty Midwest with miles and miles of wind fetch kind of windrow. It's an eastern, just kind of helping stop drifting a little bit kind of windrow, okay? But what I want to talk to you now is not just about how to make a windrow. That would be worthy of its own video, right? But I want to delve a little bit more into the idea of function stacking within the systems that you build and getting more than one use out of every system. Now, the first thought I want to share with this is that a system should have a primary function, okay? The primary function of the windrow is to block wind and make the snow drift that way instead of that way, okay? So that has to be the primary consideration for everything that follows. Because if I do too much food forestry here and not enough windrow, I will end up with a system which does not fulfill its original intended purpose, okay? If you're building a pasture, its primary purpose is feeding critters of some sort. Yes, it is good to do silvopasture, it is good to do agroforestry, it is good to function stack in there and get orchard fruits and all these other things. That's good. But it still has to fulfill the basic function of feeding your critters whatever those critters are, okay? You know, and so on and so forth. If something's primary purpose is to be a food forest, then you don't want to build so much windrow into it that you're compromising its food production ability, okay? So, in this, keep that in mind. The primary purpose is blocking the wind. And, well, not so much blocking the wind, but creating enough turbulence within the wind that all of the snow drops somewhere other than right on top of my driveway. Okay, it doesn't have to be a perfect solid barrier, but it has to break up the wind enough that there isn't directional wind piling against the existing windrow with the driveway right here dropping all the snow in front of the existing trees. Okay, so you put some trees out here so that it's chaotic movement throughout the whole area and drops evenly. That's the goal, okay? Now, the trees we want to do this with are, of course, conifers. So my windrow has, and I did a little bit out here last winter with a very brief walkthrough, but I want to talk about this again in brief, and then how we're expanding upon it. If you pan the camera over here a little bit. The outermost row is made up of these white cedars. So these will be really dense, okay? They'll keep branches close to the ground, but the deer will, in time, eat off all of these lower branches because they like this stuff, right? The tree tombs will protect them enough that they'll be able to get enough headspace that the deer won't kill them, but they're going to mow these branches down, okay? So in closer, that's the row, that's the trees closest to the driveway. They're closest to the driveway because they're the densest, and they're the least tolerant of harsh wind. So they're in they're dense and they're in the most protected location once this is all grown up. Now in here, this one got tousled by the deer, but he still is regrowing. Okay, this guy is a balsam fir. This is the main core of the windrow. I planted these guys 35 feet apart, at which point, when they're mature, their branches will just touch, but not fully close. Okay? Now, they're staggered relative to the cedars. So when you have, you know, our cedars are in pairs here and here, and then there's a balsam in the middle. So the wind will split across the balsam, but still be stopped by the cedars. So they're on a stagger pattern. These are much more resistant of wind than the cedars, and they're also a taller tree, and they will have branches that go all the way to the ground. So they will fill in those gaps where the deer eat the branches off the lower ends of the cedar. And then the outermost tree in the windrow are a pine. The balsam firs are a conical tree. Most of their branch mass is close to the ground and it tapers toward the top. Pines have a tendency to have a relatively clean bowl coming up from the ground and then expand, and they put the majority of their leaf matter at the top of the tree. So these are also on a stagger pattern relative to the balsam firs. Okay. And these are, pines, so they will have their branches bushing up down here where the balsam fir will be splayed out across the ground. So in total, all 3 layers, everywhere the wind wants to blow, there will be something to break up any directional winds, like straight line directional winds. And that will spin out the snow in the windbreak. It won't just push the wind up and down, which drops all the snow on your driveway. It's just going to make it adequately chaotic that it spins out the drift here instead of right where we don't want it. Now, this is where we get to, so that's the main function. That's the main structure of it. Okay? Now, here's where we get into function stacking. Are there edible pines? Are there edible conifers? Yes, there are. Pine nuts are very expensive. And pine nuts come from pine trees. Specific pine trees, but they come from pine trees. There are several species that are cold hardy in our climate. Okay? Pinus monophylla is a type of pinion that's cold hardy here, but that really wants dry conditions and would be a little too wet for it in this site. Pinus sembra from the Swiss stone pine from the Alps produces an edible nut. I have some of those in pots, but they're not ready to go to grow out. They'll be several years. And this is Pinus coreensis, the Korean nut pine. Okay. Now these guys are about 5 years old. If I press this down, you can zoom in as much as you can, beloved.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have some grass in the way. Should have thought about that. Knock him down a little bit. So, pines have an interesting growth pattern which is different from the other trees. And that is when they're young, they sprout and then they enter what botanists call the grass stage, where they grow very slowly and they'll often produce needles which are longer than their mature needles. And they literally look like a tuft of grass. And they will sit there in the grass stage, not growing much height, but growing a lot of root mass. And then once their roots are where they want to be, then they will start to grow top very, very rapidly. They'll come out of the grass stage and they'll develop top. The grass stage is usually 4 or 5 years for the pines that do this. Pretty much all of the nut pines have a grass stage. That's why they're so hard to find in nurseries. Because the nursery standard practice is every year you repot your tree and you double the price. Okay? So pines that sit there and only grow 4 inches in 5 years, and then 4 inches the subsequent year, and then 1.5 feet every year thereafter, they're going to have to be 6 or 7 or 8 years old before they're tall enough that nursery buyers are interested, and that would be a $300 or $400 tree, just because of the time involved. That's why you can't ever find pine nut producing pines in nurseries. The economics of it and the customers aren't educated well enough to understand those economics, so it's a losing deal for the nursery. Okay, so you almost have to buy them. You can either get them as 1-year-old plugs, or you can just start your own seed. Okay, so these I had in pots. I bought 1-year-old plugs. I grew them in pots for 2 years, and then I transplanted them 2 years ago. Now that transplant set it back, so it kind of restarted the grass phase because it had to regrow new roots. And now this year, this grew from the ground to my left hand in 5 years, and from my left hand to my right hand in the last month. Okay? So right now the tree, it's going to be hard to see in the camera, I'm sure. The tree is right here where my finger is. This is the top growing bud of the tree. And more than half of that growth has happened this month, literally. Because it just left the grass stage and now it's starting to produce top growth. Okay? So he's happy. A few of these died out. And this is another thing that I want to talk about. When you're doing large plantings or conservation plantings, it's a little different than buying a single expensive tree and investing in that tree in that place. I want a windrow. I want it species diverse. I want a general structure. But within that structure, I want it to play around on its own a little bit. Okay? So when I first planted this, I planted 3 species. But now, I assumed that some of those would die out. All of the ones that died out, I replaced with another pine nut producing pine, the lacebark pine. Okay? So the lacebark pine, a beautiful, beautiful tree, beautiful bark. I put them near the edges where they would be more visible and used them to replace some of these that died out. So now there's 4 species. And right now what I'm about to do is plant a couple more species. You see, we don't just want the conifers. We also want nitrogen fixers to build the soil. Remember, I've talked about the soil here on our farm a couple times now. And it's degraded former potato field. I want to be able to enrich the soil as we go along. So I have some legumes. And I'm going to plant these in between the main structure. And if you want to pan over to that bigger spruce, sorry, not spruce, the balsam, okay? The main structure, over where we were a minute ago, the food producing tree, and I'm going to put the nitrogen fixer right in the middle, okay? The nitrogen fixer I'm going to use is also an ornamental tree. If we get low on battery, just tell me.
We're low on battery.
We're low on battery. Just tell me if we get too low.
We're less than 20%.
That's fine. We'll get through.
Okay.
We'll get through. There isn't too much more to do here. These are some seed-grown. This guy did not make the winter, and this guy did not make the winter. So there's my hardiness testing. Okay. These are some seed-grown Sephora japonicas. The Japanese pagoda tree, or Japanese scholar tree. Okay. And I'm going to plant these guys to add the function of nitrogen fixing into this windrow. Now again, this is conservation planting. I'm using 1 nitrogen fixer now. I'm going to plant these quickly. I'm not babying them. And I'm assuming that I won't have 100% survival. Okay? So this is the difference between investing a ton of time into an expensive nursery tree and large-scale plantings across the landscape. When I'm doing large-scale plantings, I don't invest the same amount of time per tree, but I put out a lot more trees, assuming some will die. I plant large plantings of a small number of species, and then when they die, I always use a different species. And that's where my species diversity is going to come from. I like to do it that way because I don't know which ones are going to make it at the beginning. Maybe that guy will be the winner, maybe he won't be the winner, will be replaced by a different species. But by doing large out plants of a small number of species, I know that those will become dominant species. And then I'll tuck the others in, around other places. Usually, just going to kind of make sure those roots are covered. The species that I start with will be either the one I'm absolutely most interested in or the cheapest. And just do a large, quick planting of the cheap, inexpensive plant material. And then the ones that I poke in where the first run die, those will be more expensive harder to find, or just species that I don't want as many of, okay, and are there for diversity. Now the other function I want to put in here is a little bit more food.
Hold on. There we go.
So along the edge of this planting, these were a couple of trees that I just poked in. They were not in good shape when I put them in. They didn't make it. These were some black spruce. This is not a great habitat for black spruce. I had them. They were pot bound. They were going to die regardless of whether I planted them or not, so I just stuck them in. Okay? But they obviously, that one's going to make it. He's a tough bugger. These two didn't. So where these are, I'm going to come right in these same spots. I'll just pull him out. And I'm going to put in some northern hardy pecan bare root. I already have several of these in from, I have 3 different strains from 2 different nurseries of these in, all in small number. And this is another tree that I'm poking in where something else died to slowly expand my diversity and expand functions. But now this is not a conifer, so he's staying toward the windward side and will have much less impact on the function of the windbreak itself as a windbreak. Okay? So that's why these guys are going on the outside. I'll poke him in here, I'll poke another one in there, and I'll poke one in up that away somewhere. Okay? And they'll make it or not. It's okay. I got these for like $2 a piece. Right? So I'll just poke them in, let the hardiest survive. That's going to be part of my hardiness testing to make sure I get the best trees. And I will next year and the year after see what has made it from this year's planting, see what is not, see what was strong and the dumb deer killed, and then come back and readjust and add more species and more functions over time. When you're planning a permaculture environment, you don't have to plan absolutely everything from day one. Plan for your functions, knock in the bulk, but then you have your whole life on that property to expand functions, expand species diversity, and grow in resilience every year. So, I hope this has been interesting and useful. I hope it gives you some ideas, and I hope that you will look beyond just the idea of windbreak, right? The concepts I'm talking about are fairly universal. These are the same, an orchard I would put in the same way. A wildlife planting I would put in the same way, right? So think about how some of these ideas relate to your context and your design goals, and have fun with it. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up if you like it so the algorithm knows to show it to others, and I will see you next time on the farm.